The screams coming from inside the cabin were enough to make any man turn his horse around and ride in the opposite direction. But Asher Xavier had never been the kind of cowboy who ran from trouble. He dismounted in front of the weathered structure just outside Wichita, Kansas, tying his mare to the hitching post as another agonized cry pierced the hot August air of 1878. The cholera outbreak had spread through the plains like wildfire that summer, claiming entire families in a matter of days, and every sensible person in the territory knew that getting within 50 feet of an infected soul was tantamount to signing your own death warrant. The door hung slightly ajar, and through the gap, Asher could see a figure writhing on a narrow bed. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with a low groan. The smell hit him immediately, the unmistakable stench of sickness that accompanied the disease. A young woman lay on the bed, her dark hair plastered to her face with sweat, her body convulsing with another wave of cramps. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and even from the doorway he could see that she was severely dehydrated. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Water." Asher looked back at his horse, then at the woman again. Every instinct he possessed told him to leave to protect himself, to ride back to town and report another cholera victim to the authorities. But something in her eyes, even glazed with fever as they were, stopped him. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, roughly his own age, and the thought of leaving her to die alone in this miserable cabin made his stomach turn. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "My name is Asher," he said, moving toward the bed. "I am going to help you." The woman tried to speak, but another spasm racked her body and she doubled over, retching into a bucket beside the bed. When the worst had passed, she collapsed back onto the sweat-soaked pillow, tears streaming down her face. "Francesca," she managed to gasp. "Francesca Kane." Asher found a pitcher by the washstand, but it was empty. He grabbed it and headed outside to the well, working the pump until clear water gushed into the vessel. When he returned, Francesca's eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment he thought he had lost her already. But then her chest rose with a shallow breath, and he exhaled in relief. He poured water into a tin cup and carefully lifted her head, bringing the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, desperately, but he pulled it away after just a few sips. "Not too much at once," he said gently. "It will just come back up." Over the next hour, he gave her water in small amounts, letting her body adjust between each sip. He found relatively clean cloths in a chest by the window and soaked them in the cool well water, placing them on her forehead and neck. The fever was intense, and her skin burned beneath his touch. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Francesca's eyes opened more fully, focusing on him with something approaching clarity. "You should not be here," she whispered. "You will get sick too." "Maybe," Asher replied, wringing out another cloth, "but I am not leaving you." "Why?" The question was simple but loaded with confusion and gratitude. "You do not even know me." Asher paused, considering his answer. He had been drifting for 2 years since his parents died, working cattle drives and odd jobs from Texas to Montana, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. The solitary life had suited him, or so he had thought. But looking at this young woman fighting for her life, he realized that he had been running from connection rather than embracing solitude. "Because it is the right thing to do," he finally said. Through the night, Francesca's condition worsened. The violent purging continued, leaving her weaker with each episode. Asher stayed by her side, offering water, changing the cloths, and cleaning up the evidence of her illness without complaint. His own stomach churned with fear and exhaustion, but he pushed those feelings aside. She needed him to be strong, In the early hours of the morning, when the darkness was deepest, Francesca began to shake uncontrollably. Her teeth chattered, and her skin felt cold despite the summer heat. Asher recognized the signs of severe dehydration and shock. He had seen cholera before, had lost neighbors to it when he was younger. This was the critical point where patients either started to recover or slipped away entirely. He pulled the thin blanket up around her shoulders, then made a decision. He lay down beside her on the narrow bed, wrapping his arms around her trembling form, sharing his body heat. It was improper by any standard of decency, but propriety meant nothing when weighed against a human life. "Stay with me, Francesca," he murmured against her hair. "Keep fighting. You are stronger than this sickness." Whether she heard him or not, he could not tell, but gradually her shaking subsided. She turned slightly in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, and for the first time in hours, she seemed to rest. When dawn broke through the cabin's single window, Asher carefully extricated himself and checked on his patient. Francesca's breathing was more regular, and though her skin was still pale and clammy, the fever seemed to have broken slightly. He allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. He went outside to tend to his horse, giving the animal water and the feed he found in the small barn behind the cabin. The morning was already growing warm, promising another scorching day. As he worked, he wondered about Francesca. The cabin was modest but well kept, or had been before she fell ill. There were books on a shelf, a handmade quilt folded over a chair, and a photograph in a simple frame showing a severe-looking couple who might have been her parents. When he returned inside, Francesca's eyes were open, watching the doorway. "You came back," she said, her voice still weak but clearer than before. "Of course I came back." Asher poured fresh water into the cup. "How are you feeling?" "Like I have been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted, attempting a small smile. "But alive, which is more than I expected." Over the course of that day, Asher learned Francesca's story in fragments, shared between sips of water and long periods of rest. She and her husband had traveled to Kansas 2 years earlier, full of dreams about farming the prairie. But William Kane had been thrown from his horse 6 months ago, breaking his neck. He died instantly, leaving Francesca alone with a homestead claim and no family within 500 miles. She had managed on her own, taking in sewing and laundry from the people in Wichita to supplement what little she could grow in her garden. When the cholera outbreak began, she had tried to be careful, but illness was not something that could be completely avoided when you dealt with people's clothing and linens. "I thought about William when I got sick," she confessed on the second evening, when she was finally able to sit up for short periods. "I thought maybe I would be seeing him again soon." Asher, who was heating broth he had made from supplies in her pantry, turned to look at her. "Did you love him very much?" Francesca was quiet for a long moment. "I respected him. He was kind to me and we were comfortable together. But love," she shook her head slightly. "We were practical people making a practical arrangement. I needed security and he needed a wife. It worked well enough." There was a sadness in her words that made Asher's chest tighten. He brought her the broth and watched as she took careful sips, keeping it down this time. "You deserve more than just practical," he said softly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition that transcended the nurse-patient relationship. Francesca looked away first, color rising in her pale cheeks. By the third day, Francesca was markedly improved. She could stand with assistance and managed to eat a full bowl of broth along with some dry bread. Asher had barely slept, catching only brief naps in the chair by her bed, always alert for any change in her condition. His own body ached with exhaustion, and he knew he was taking an enormous risk by staying, But each time he considered leaving, he found himself unable to walk away. On the fourth day, disaster struck. Asher woke from a light doze to find the room spinning. His stomach clenched painfully and a wave of nausea swept over him. He tried to stand, but his legs would not cooperate. He crashed to the floor, startling Francesca awake. "Asher!" Her voice was alarmed. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, still weak but mobile. "What is wrong?" He tried to answer, but his body convulsed, and he retched violently. The truth was immediately apparent to both of them. Despite all his precautions, the cholera had found him. Francesca moved with surprising speed for someone who had been at death's door just days before. She grabbed the bucket and positioned it near him, then soaked cloths in water exactly as he had done for her. When the first round of purging ended, leaving Asher shaking and miserable on the cabin floor, she helped him to the bed. "No," he protested weakly. "You need to rest. You are not strong enough." "I am strong enough for this," she said firmly, her hands gentle as she removed his boots and helped him lie down. "You saved my life, Asher Xavier. Now I am going to save yours." The roles had reversed entirely. Now it was Francesca who sat vigil through the night, offering water in small sips, cooling his fever with damp cloths, and cleaning up after him without complaint. Asher's illness followed the same brutal pattern hers had. The purging, the fever, the cramps that felt like his insides were tearing apart. But through it all, Francesca was there. She talked to him during the worst moments, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a shopkeeper. She described the journey west, the endless prairie, the terror and exhilaration of starting a new life. She confessed her loneliness after William died, the nights when she cried herself to sleep wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in leaving everything familiar behind. "But then you came," she whispered during one particularly bad night, when Asher was delirious with fever. "You walked through that door when any sensible person would have run, and you stayed. I have never known anyone with that kind of courage." Asher wanted to tell her that it was not courage, that he had simply been unable to leave her. That from the moment he saw her suffering, something fundamental had shifted inside him. But he could not form the words, could only grip her hand as another wave of illness crashed over him. His recovery was faster than hers had been, perhaps because Francesca knew what to expect and could treat him more effectively from the start. By the end of the first day, his fever had broken. By the second day, he could keep down broth and water. On the third day, he was able to sit up and even stand for short periods. They were both weak, both recovering but alive. Against all odds, they had both survived the disease that had killed so many others. One morning, about a week after Asher had first fallen ill, they sat together on the cabin's front porch, watching the sunrise paint the Kansas sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cooler now, hinting at the approach of autumn. Asher's horse grazed peacefully in the small paddock, content after days of rest. "What will you do now?" Francesca asked quietly. "You said you were drifting, working cattle drives. I suppose you will want to get back to that." Asher turned to look at her. The illness had left them both thinner, more fragile in appearance, but he thought she had never been more beautiful. The morning light caught in her dark hair, and her eyes held a depth of emotion that made his heart race. "What if I said I did not want to drift anymore?" he asked. "What if I said I wanted to stay here in Wichita? Maybe find work at one of the ranches nearby or help you with this homestead?" Francesca's breath caught. "Asher, you do not owe me anything. You do not have to stay out of obligation. That is not why I would be staying." He reached out and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Francesca, in all my years of drifting, I never found a place that felt like home. But these past 2 weeks, taking care of you, having you take care of me, I realized something. Home is not a place, it is a person. And I think maybe you could be my home if you would have me. Tears filled Francesca's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. You would really stay, even knowing that I have so little to offer. This cabin is small, the land is difficult, and I have no money to speak of. I do not care about any of that. Asher cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. I care about you. I think I started caring about you the moment I heard you calling for water, and over these past weeks, caring turned into something deeper. I am in love with you, Francesca Kane. I know it is fast, and I know we have only known each other in the worst of circumstances, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you too, Francesca whispered. I fought so hard to stay alive, and I think part of me was fighting for you, fighting for the possibility of this. Of us. Asher leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and tender, a promise sealed between two people who had survived the impossible together. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through their tears. The next few weeks were a time of healing and building. Asher moved his few possessions into the cabin, and together they worked to restore the homestead. He was stronger than Francesca, and he took on the heavier tasks, repairing the barn roof, splitting firewood, and clearing land for next spring's planting. She focused on the house, sewing, cooking, and slowly rebuilding her strength. In early October, on a crisp morning when the leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of coming winter, Asher rode into Wichita and returned with a preacher. They were married that afternoon in the cabin doorway, with Francesca wearing a simple blue dress she had sewn herself and Asher in his best shirt and clean trousers. There were no guests, no elaborate ceremony, but as they exchanged vows, both felt that this was exactly as it should be. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a culmination of the deep emotional bond they had formed during their shared ordeal. Asher was gentle with Francesca, mindful of how recently she had been ill. She welcomed him with open arms and an open heart, and their physical union felt like a natural extension of the love they had already declared. Winter came early that year, with the first snows falling in mid-November. Asher found work at a ranch 10 miles outside Wichita, breaking horses and helping with the cattle. The pay was modest but steady, and it gave them enough to buy supplies and start planning for the future. On his days off, he worked on expanding the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as a proper bedroom. Francesca took in more sewing, and her reputation for fine needlework spread through the region. Women came from Wichita and even farther to commission dresses and quilts. She was busy and productive, but she always stopped what she was doing when Asher came home, greeting him with a kiss and a warm meal. They talked about everything during those long winter evenings. Asher shared stories of his childhood in Missouri, of his parents who had died of fever, of the years he spent wandering. Francesca told him about her marriage to William, not hiding the truth that it had been loveless, but explaining how it had taught her the value of partnership and commitment. "What we have is different," she said one night as they lay together under the quilts, the fire crackling in the hearth. "With William, I always felt like we were two separate people sharing a space. With you, I feel like we are two halves of the same whole." "I feel that too," Asher agreed, pulling her closer. "Like I was incomplete before I found you." In February, Francesca began to feel ill in the mornings. At first, both of them panicked, terrified that the cholera had returned. But as the days passed and no other symptoms appeared, a different possibility emerged. Francesca went to see the doctor in Wichita, and her suspicions were confirmed. She was pregnant. When she told Asher that evening, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with joy. They had not expected it to happen so quickly, but the news felt like a blessing, an affirmation of the life they were building together. The pregnancy was not easy. Francesca's body, still recovering from the cholera, struggled with the demands of carrying a child. There were weeks when she was too sick to work, when Asher had to take on all the household tasks in addition to his job at the ranch. But they faced it together, just as they had faced everything else. In late September, almost exactly a year after they had married, Francesca went into labor. Asher rode frantically to Wichita to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered dozens of babies in the territory. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Asher paced outside the bedroom, his heart in his throat every time Francesca cried out. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, a baby's wail pierced the air. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the bedroom with a tired smile. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Asher rushed past her into the bedroom. Francesca lay propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up as he entered, and the love shining in her eyes took his breath away. "Meet your son," she said softly. Asher approached the bed reverently, looking down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair like his mother and was howling lustily, his little face red with the effort. Carefully, Asher sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately wrapped around his, and Asher felt tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Asher whispered. "You are amazing. I love you so much. I love you too." Francesca leaned her head against his shoulder. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Asher thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The sickness, the risk, the love that had grown from the darkest of circumstances. "What about Samuel?" he suggested. "Samuel Xavier." "Samuel," Francesca repeated, testing the name. "Yes, that is perfect." Life with a baby was challenging in ways neither of them had anticipated. Samuel was a fussy infant who did not sleep well and seemed to cry at all hours. Francesca was exhausted, still recovering from the difficult birth, and Asher took on as much as he could, walking the floor with Samuel in the middle of the night so Francesca could rest. But despite the challenges, they were happy. Watching Samuel grow and change, seeing him smile for the first time, hearing his first laugh, these moments filled their lives with joy. Asher would sometimes stand in the doorway of the cabin, watching Francesca nurse their son, and marvel at how much his life had changed in just 2 years. When Samuel was 6 months old, Asher was offered a foreman position at the ranch where he worked. It came with better pay and a small house on the ranch property. He discussed it with Francesca, not wanting to make the decision without her input. "It would be easier in some ways," she admitted. "The house is larger and we would be closer to neighbors. But this cabin, this land, it is where we began. It is where we fell in love." "Then we stay," Asher said immediately. "We can use the extra money to improve the homestead, maybe buy some cattle of our own. This is our home, and that is what matters." They declined the offer but negotiated for the pay increase anyway, with Asher agreeing to take on additional responsibilities. With the extra income, they were able to hire help during the busiest seasons, giving them more time with Samuel. The years passed with the steady rhythm of prairie life. Summers were hot and dry, winters cold and harsh, but through it all, Asher and Francesca's love deepened. They had disagreements, as any couple does, but they had learned to communicate during those intense weeks of illness, and that foundation of honest conversation served them well. When Samuel was 2, Francesca became pregnant again. This time, her body handled it better, and though there were still difficult days, the pregnancy was easier overall. In the spring of 1882, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. The little girl was quieter than her brother had been, with Asher's blue eyes and a sweet temperament. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Asher taught him to be gentle, to hold her carefully, and the bond between the siblings was evident from the start. The homestead prospered. With Asher's skill with horses and Francesca's sewing business, they built a comfortable life. They expanded the cabin again, adding a third room for the children to share. Asher built a proper barn and bought a small herd of cattle, which he managed alongside his ranch work. Francesca's garden flourished, providing vegetables and herbs that she sold at the market in Wichita. By their 5th anniversary, they had become respected members of the community. The story of how they met, how Asher had risked his life to care for a stranger, had spread through the region, becoming something of a legend. People spoke of them with admiration, pointing to their marriage as an example of true love. One evening in the summer of 1884, after the children had been put to bed, Asher and Francesca sat on their porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Samuel was 4 now, Rose 2, and Francesca had recently confirmed that she was pregnant with their 3rd child. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Francesca asked, her head resting on Asher's shoulder. "When you walked into the cabin and I was so sick." "All the time," Asher admitted. "I think about how close I came to riding past, to leaving you there. And then I think about everything I would have missed if I had. We have built something wonderful, have we not?" Francesca's hand rested on her gently swelling belly. "A family, a home, a life worth living. More than wonderful, magical." Asher kissed the top of her head. "You know, before I met you, I thought I was content being alone. I told myself I did not need anyone, that I was happier drifting. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of losing people I loved the way I lost my parents, scared of being hurt. And now," Francesca looked up at him, "now I know that love is worth the risk, that the possibility of loss does not diminish the value of what we have. Every day with you, with our children, is a gift, and I would risk everything all over again for this life we have together." "I feel the same way." Francesca smiled. "You know, when William died, I thought my life was over in a sense. I thought I would just go through the motions, existing but not really living. But then the cholera came and you came, and suddenly I had a reason to fight. You gave me back my life, Asher." "We gave each other life," Asher corrected gently. "You fought just as hard to save me as I did to save you. We are partners in every sense of the word." Their 3rd child, a son they named Matthew, was born in January of 1885. The birth was easier than the previous 2, and Francesca recovered quickly. Matthew was a happy baby, quick to smile, and he completed their family in a way that felt perfect. As the children grew, Asher made sure they knew the story of how their parents met. He did not spare the difficult details, believing it was important for Samuel, Rose, and Matthew to understand that love sometimes required sacrifice and courage. But he also emphasized the joy that had come from those dark days, the family that had grown from that initial act of compassion. By 1890, the homestead had grown into a proper ranch. Asher had saved enough to buy the surrounding land, and they now ran a successful cattle operation alongside Francesca's thriving sewing business. Samuel, at 10 years old, was already skilled with horses and helped his father with the ranch work. Rose, 8, showed her mother's talent for needlework and spent hours at the sewing machine. Matthew, 5, was still figuring out where his interests lay but showed promise in everything he tried. On their 10-year anniversary, Asher surprised Francesca with a trip to Wichita. They left the children with neighbors and spent 2 nights at the town's modest hotel, attending a dance and eating at the restaurant. It was their first time away from the ranch in years, and they treasured the opportunity to be just a couple again, not just parents and business partners. As they danced to a waltz performed by a local band, Asher pulled Francesca close and spoke into her ear. 10 years ago, I thought my life would be cattle drives and wandering until I was too old to work. I never imagined I would have this, a family, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me all of that. Francesca pulled back enough to look into his eyes. We gave it to each other. And I hope we have at least 40 more years together to keep building on what we have created. At least 40, Asher agreed, spinning her across the dance floor. Probably more like 50 or 60 if I have any say in it. They laughed together, and in that moment, surrounded by other couples and the cheerful music, they were transported back to that cabin, to the desperate days when survival was far from guaranteed. But they had survived, both of them, and more than that, they had thrived. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Samuel married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch when he was 20, and he and his bride built a house on the Xavier land, helping to expand the family operation. Rose met a young teacher from Wichita and married him at 21, moving into town but visiting the ranch every Sunday. Matthew showed an interest in medicine, inspired by hearing stories of how his parents had nursed each other through cholera, and he went to study in Kansas City with plans to return and serve the community. Through it all, Asher and Francesca's love remained the foundation of the family. They supported each other through the challenges of aging, of watching their children leave home, of dealing with the losses that inevitably came with time. When Francesca's hair started going gray in her 40s, Asher told her she was more beautiful than ever. When Asher's back started bothering him from decades of ranch work, Francesca rubbed liniment into his muscles every evening. In 1900, on the dawn of a new century, they celebrated their 22nd anniversary. Samuel and his wife had given them 3 grandchildren. Rose had 2, with another on the way. Matthew had returned from medical school and opened a practice in Wichita, already making a name for himself as a skilled and compassionate doctor. Asher and Francesca sat on the same porch where they had shared so many evenings, watching the sun set over the prairie they had tamed together. They were both in their early 40s now, their faces lined with the passage of time but their love as strong as ever. "You have any regrets?" Francesca asked, a question that had become something of a tradition in their anniversary conversations. "Not a single one," Asher replied, the answer always the same. "You? Never." "Well, except maybe that I did not meet you sooner so we could have had even more years together." "We have had 22 beautiful years, and we have many more to come." Asher squeezed her hand. "Besides, we met exactly when we were supposed to, any sooner, and who knows if the circumstances would have been right. Maybe I needed to be that drifting cowboy, lost and alone, so I could truly appreciate finding you." "Always the romantic," Francesca teased, but her eyes were soft with affection. "Only for you," Asher said, leaning in to kiss her. As they sat there in the fading light, surrounded by the land they had worked, the life they had built, and the family they had created, both Asher and Francesca reflected on the journey that had brought them together. It had started with illness and risk, with a decision to stay when every instinct said to run. But from those desperate days had grown something beautiful and lasting, a love story that would be passed down through generations. Their grandchildren would grow up hearing the tale of how Grandpa Asher had walked into a cabin where Grandma Francesca lay dying of cholera, how he had stayed to nurse her back to health despite the risk, and how she had returned the favor when he fell ill. They would hear about the love that blossomed in the darkest of circumstances, about the family that grew from that love, and about the ranch that stood as a testament to what two people could build when they faced the world together. And years later, when Asher and Francesca were old and gray, sitting on that same porch with great-grandchildren playing in the yard, they would still hold hands and marvel at the path their lives had taken. They had risked everything for each other, had chosen love when it would have been easier to choose safety, and they had been rewarded with a life richer than either could have imagined. The cholera epidemic of 1878 had taken so many lives, had devastated communities across Kansas and beyond. But for Asher Xavier and Francesca Kane, it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. Their love had been forged in suffering and solidified in survival, and nothing that came after could shake the foundation they had built in that small cabin outside Wichita. As the new century unfolded, bringing changes and challenges that no one could have predicted, the Xavier Ranch remained a constant. It was a place where family gathered, where love was celebrated, and where the story of Asher and Francesca was told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unlikely of circumstances, and that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. In 1915, when both Asher and Francesca were in their late 50s, they decided to host a grand celebration for their 35th anniversary. All three of their children came home, bringing spouses and grandchildren. The ranch house, which had been expanded multiple times over the years, was full of laughter and life. During the celebration, Samuel stood up to make a toast. Now a father of 4 himself, he spoke with emotion about the example his parents had set. "My father taught me that real strength is not about physical power or dominance," Samuel said, his voice carrying across the gathered family. "It is about knowing when to stay, when to care, when to put someone else's needs above your own safety. And my mother taught me that grace and courage can exist in the same person, that vulnerability can be a kind of strength. Together, they have shown all of us what marriage should be, what partnership looks like, what it means to truly love someone." Asher and Francesca sat at the head of the table, hands clasped together, tears streaming down their faces as their children and grandchildren applauded. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, they walked out to the old cabin where their story had begun. It was still standing, though they no longer lived there. Asher had refused to tear it down, instead maintaining it as a kind of monument to their beginning. They stepped inside, and in the moonlight filtering through the window, they could almost see their younger selves, sick and scared but determined to survive. "I can still remember exactly how you looked that first day," Francesca said softly. "Standing in that doorway, a stranger who chose to become my savior. And I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met," Asher replied. "The way you kept fighting, even when you had every reason to give up." They stood in the cabin for a long time, remembering, reflecting, and thanking whatever force had brought them together. Then they walked back to the ranch house, to the life they had built, to the family that was their legacy. The years that followed brought both joy and sorrow, as all lives do. They lost friends and saw their children face their own challenges. But through it all, Asher and Francesca remained each other's anchor, the constant in a changing world. In 1925, as they approached their 45th anniversary, both were showing the true signs of age. Asher's hair was completely white, and he moved more slowly, his body bearing the accumulated aches of decades of hard work. Francesca had developed arthritis in her hands, making sewing difficult, though she still insisted on making quilts for each new great-grandchild. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching yet another sunset, Francesca suddenly turned to Asher with a serious expression. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything," Asher replied, concern flickering across his face. "Promise me that when one of us goes, the other will not give up, will not stop living. We have built something too beautiful, and our family needs us both for as long as possible." Asher was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I promise, though I cannot imagine this world without you in it." "You will not have to imagine it for a long time yet," Francesca said firmly. "We still have years ahead of us." And they did. They lived to see their golden anniversary in 1930, a celebration that drew family from across Kansas and beyond. By then, they had 9 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren, a sprawling family tree that had grown from their love. The party was magnificent, with long tables set up in the yard, musicians playing, and more food than even that large gathering could consume. As the sun began to set, Asher stood up to speak, his voice wavering but strong. 50 years ago, I walked into a cabin and met a woman who changed my life. I did not know it then, but that moment was the pivot point of my entire existence. Everything before was prologue, and everything after has been the real story. Francesca, you have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. You have given me children who make me proud, grandchildren who fill my heart with joy, and great-grandchildren who remind me that our love will echo through generations. I would do it all again, every moment, every challenge, every joy. Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for building this incredible life with me." There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Francesca stood and embraced her husband. They kissed, as they had kissed so many times over the past 50 years, and the family erupted in applause. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Asher and Francesca walked slowly to the old cabin one more time. They moved more carefully now, Asher using a cane and Francesca leaning on his arm, but they made the journey together. Inside, they sat on the old bed which Asher had maintained over the years and looked around at the place where everything had begun. 50 years, Francesca marveled. Half a century since you saved my life. Since we saved each other, Asher corrected, as he always did. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 old people who had lived fully and loved deeply. Outside, the Kansas night was warm and still, the stars brilliant overhead. And in that cabin, Asher Xavier and Francesca Kane held hands and remembered, grateful for every single day they had been given, every challenge they had overcome together, and every moment of love that had filled their extraordinary life. Their story would live on in the family they had created, in the ranch that still bore the Xavier name, and in the example they had set of what love could be when nurtured with courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment. From the darkest of beginnings had come the brightest of lives, and neither of them would have changed a single moment of the journey.